So my presentation today, as you see, the title is Migration, Compassion, and Justice, Expanding Socio-Economic Rights and Categories of Inclusion. And this is what I'd like to discuss with you. First of all, to use as an example the humanitarian crisis on the EU border, you may be aware of this, that there are many migrants, refugees living in basically in makeshift camps in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And so we'll discuss that briefly as an example of what that means for the refugee and migrant binary, what this is in terms of refugee status definitions, how social and economic rights are part of this in countries of origin and arrival. What does social psychology and empathy have to do with justice and the law? As it turns out, a lot. So I'll mention a little bit about that. And lastly, we'll close off reflecting on environmental displacement and climate justice as it relates to the subject. So first of all, let's see if this is going. First of all, social and economic rights are aplenty in the Universal Declaration. There's many articles that refer to right to employment, right to education, etc. But I pulled out this one that's particularly important in Article 25, that everyone has a right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being for himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, medical care, and necessary social services. Security, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, and lack of livelihood should also be taken care of by the state. So from this, of course, from the Universal Declaration, we know we have many international instruments, the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, and many more. But this is at the baseline. So now we have a humanitarian situation on the border with the European Union. And what is happening is that migrants, asylum seekers are coming from conflict-ridden, impoverished parts of the world. They're primarily coming from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, from Yemen. They're coming in large numbers. They're oftentimes said to be primarily men, but that's not the case. There's also families in there. There's also children, unaccompanied minors. In the bottom picture there, you can see children sleeping in the rough. So because they are trying to enter the European Union and cross the border into Croatia and are being prevented from doing so, that's called an illegal pushback at the border, they are left on their own in Bosnia and Herzegovina because nobody is, there's difficulties in who is responsible. Is it the European Union or is it the Bosnia and Herzegovina? And there is an inadequate response from these states. And many of these persons are living in just makeshift camps, impoverished conditions. They're very vulnerable. They don't have sanitary conditions. Some of them are susceptible to COVID. So of course, it's in the middle of the pandemic. And this has been going on since the last couple of years. It's been problematic, but since the end of last year, it's become a humanitarian crisis. And over the last couple of months, of course, in the winter, it has gotten worse. So here you just see a few of the photos to give you an idea of the situation. So what often happens in situations like this is there is a distinction between who is a refugee and who is a migrant, right? So a refugee under international law is a person that has a well-founded fear of persecution based on 5 grounds: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, membership in a particular social group. This comes from the Refugee Convention, from the 1951 Refugee Convention, and many national laws, and also persons fleeing wars and armed conflict. Whereas a migrant is seen as somebody that is moving voluntarily, not involuntarily, but moving to improve their social and economic living conditions. They're coming from places of poverty. They want to find work, education, or reunite with their family. And what happens often is that these reasonings overlap. The stories are very complex, whether persons come by choice or they're forced. So many persons fall in between these categories, between refugee and migrant. And what happens is that we have a migrant-refugee binary that becomes very, very political. Now, why would it be political? Why would states want to distinguish between these drivers of migration, whether they're socioeconomic or whether they're persecution, considered persecution as per the 1951 Refugee Convention? Well, it's because most states want to extend their assistance and their protection with social and economic rights to a limited number of persons. And there's often these ideas about pull factors, so you don't want to create pull factors. And what happens is that these categories of who is deserving and who is undeserving develop. Who deserves human rights protection and who doesn't? Who deserves humanitarian assistance and who doesn't? And asylum seekers are often found as being victims, if they fulfill the refugee definition, that are deserving of empathy. But if they're not, if they're seen as economic migrants, then they're bogus claimants, they don't deserve assistance. And then so the response is, what you see in the Bosnia situation, the humanitarian crisis, is that people are just left to be, because there's an assumption that they're economic migrants, that they're bogus claimants, and so on. Now, I pose the question, what does social psychology and empathy have to do with justice? Well, so this is what I do in my research, is that I actually dive deeply into understanding the social psychology of inclusion and exclusion. That's the first picture you see there. Who's in and who's out? We have these human psychological dispositions about empathizing with certain groups and providing rights for them, to the exclusion of others. So if you take that psychology and you apply it to international law, you realize that a lot of international law is actually driven by these social psychological factors. And empathy, our empathic response to the pain and suffering of others, is very much affecting of the type of justice that we give to others, even though law is often seen as this reasoned and very unemotional type of practice, which is actually, as I explore in my research, not necessarily so. And here you see the last picture, the Lady Justice puts on the empathy glasses and says, it was definitely better being blindfolded, because then you see much more and then you feel much more. And the reasoning becomes more difficult in some cases, more complicated, but also more just and dignified in others. I'm inserting this one picture of Juma here, the Syrian refugee in the camp in Greece and Lesbos, who had said to one of the reporters, "I can't take it anymore." He was been on the road for 3 years. And I use it to demonstrate someone that's visibly in distress, visibly has suffered, and oftentimes in the media, when we're given stories about what happens to asylum seekers and refugees, if there is an incitement of empathy, it's usually towards women and children, which is correct, because women and children are at risk. There are certain groups that are more at risk than others, and men are oftentimes seen as being able to fend for themselves, and therefore less empathy for these men. And I'd like to assert that we need to challenge that asylum seekers and refugees are vulnerable, period, including the men, for different reasons than other groups at risk. So my claim, my suggestion is that asylum seekers are migrants, and many migrants are indeed refugees. Now, some scholars would agree with me, and I use the example here of Michelle Foster. You see, she's written this book, International Refugee Law and Socio and Economic Rights. And what she has argued very eloquently, very articulately, and through very precise research is that in some jurisdictions, in some places, and she uses the examples of New Zealand, Canada, Australia, UK, and Germany, that there are courts and tribunals, especially migration tribunals, that have recognized social and economic deprivation as a ground for refugee protection. And this is very, very exceptional. So it's not something that's widely recognized. Like I said, most of the time, these asylum seekers are rejected as economic migrants. They don't fall within the refugee definition. But she's saying that, first of all, they should, because persecution is a violation of human rights, and a violation of socioeconomic rights can also be found as persecution. And the very core of what these judges have found is that at the center is the issue of human dignity, that a disregard for human dignity, which is a legal concept, does amount to degradation. And UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, has some guidelines that say some similar things. So there's bits and pieces that would make the argument that, in fact, economic migrants, or persons that have suffered these types of injustice, social deprivation, can be found as refugees. And then in asylum determination cases, when this process happens of determining of who is a refugee, there is an increasing recognition. So there's new guidelines coming, for example, from the European Asylum System Office about empathy. Empathy in determining who should receive assistance, how you treat the person that's in front of you, and so on. It's very psychological, that process. And since dignity is this evaluative legal concept, it can be recognized, as some scholars have done, as an empathic response to humiliation, degradation, vulnerability, and suffering. So the dignity aspect is applied again. And just to note again that there have been more cases from the European Court of Human Rights that have considered dignity as applying to persons' deprivation of their social economic rights, regardless of legal status. So even if they're not asylum seekers, even if they're rejected asylum seekers, if they don't have refugee status, they're just migrants, but they have not had access to shelter or to food or to basic health services, their basic social and economic rights, because there's also a spectrum, then that is a violation of European and international law, and specifically the legal concept of dignity. Now, lastly, this is the almost last important point. How does this evolution of law, of international law, how does it relate to environmental displacement, climate justice, and socioeconomic rights? Well, there's some interesting cases, two interesting cases that I'll tell you about. First of all, concerning climate refugees. Now, climate refugee is not a category under international law, and UNHCR, the UN, and other states are really resisting this, because then you'll have an influx and so on. So they're saying we need to take this carefully. However, the UN Human Rights Committee in January just of last year has made a ruling on the right to life of an asylum seeker coming from a small island in the Pacific where the sea level is rising. And this has caused in Kiribati, it's called, in Kiribati, there's been violent land disputes. It's been difficult to farm. The fresh water has been contaminated by seawater, and it has impacted basically their life and their livelihood and their health. So some of these socio and economic rights. And the UN Human Rights Committee agreed that this could be a claim for asylum. They didn't think they didn't think Kiribati had not protected the asylum seeker, but they made that claim that is now considered a landmark decision for climate refugees. And in Europe, even more recently, just in December of this year, there has been a ruling from the French court concerning a man from Bangladesh that had a respiratory disease. And once he had come to France, he's gotten better. And the argument was that if he returns to Bangladesh, which has like the worst air pollution in the world, that would be a violation of his right to health. And he was successful. And that was again considered a landmark case concerning climate refugees. So here you see these socioeconomic rights which haven't been recognized as part of refugee status, starting to increasingly be recognized in different decisions around the world. So in conclusion, there are new categories beyond the migrant refugee binary. and that these socio-economic conditions and climate change can be grounds for persecution. These rights should be recognized at arrival and destination. And something I didn't talk about very much, but there's new cases that say that denial of assistance and these types of pushbacks that are happening at the border are considered as cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. Thirdly, empathy, compassion, and its lack is very much part of the equation. It's part of the asylum determination, it's part of lawmaking, it's part of policy making, and this is the kind of conversation that we need to be having more and more, I think, in terms of our legal considerations. Where's empathy and where's the compassion? And all of these components need to be taken into consideration so that we advance our legal human rights and migration response to treat our fellow human beings with dignity. So some sources that I have used, this is very, very quick, just a flash of how the social psychological sources, empathy, how it relates to justice, or how altruism, social psychology and altruism can affect human rights. And this is what I have included in my research on the psychology of human rights and asylum frameworks, which is the last source there you see. So thank you very much.